The desert was quiet, too quiet, only the whisper of wind through brittle sage. Then the cowboy heard it, faint, fragile, a sound that didn't belong out here among bones and dust. He followed it, heart thundering, until he found a torn sack half buried in the sand. Inside, a pair of eyes, newborn, glistening, fighting for life. And then, the sound again. A voice, impossibly small, trembling on the air. "Mama." His blood ran cold. Who would abandon such innocence to die? And what kind of fate was he stepping into, lifting that sack from the earth? Out on the frontier, mercy was as dangerous as a loaded gun. Yet he couldn't turn away. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The sack was lighter than any burden he'd ever lifted. Yet in the cowboy's calloused hands it felt heavier than the weight of all his years. For inside it lay a bundle so fragile, the mere tremor of his breath seemed to threaten its hold on life. Two tiny fists no larger than pecans twitching against rough burlap, a pair of wet, glistening eyes staring up at him as if the whole world had narrowed to this one desperate plea. The wind clawed at his hat, tugged at the sweat, darkened brim, carrying with it the endless hush of the desert, the hush that had once been his comfort, his shield against memory, but now that same silence screamed at him, demanding an answer to the question no man could ignore. Would he set the sack back down and ride on, letting the desert finish what cruel hands had begun? Or would he shoulder this helpless thing and carry its cry into his own blood-stained story? His chest heaved, heart hammering in a rhythm louder than any gunshot he'd ever heard. And though his mind told him all the reasons to leave, mercy was a death sentence on the frontier. A crying child could draw vultures, bandits. Or worse, his hands would not let go, his fingers tightening around the worn fabric as though they belonged more to the baby than to him. Sweat trickled down his temples despite the coolness of dusk, and he thought of all the graves he had left behind, men he had shot, men who had shot at him, women who had turned their faces away from him when he passed, a brother whose blood had stained the sand years back, and he wondered if perhaps the desert itself had chosen this moment to test him, to place a life unmarked by sin into the hands of one carved from violence, to see if he could carry something other than regret. The infant whimpered, a sound so small it cleaved him open, and the cowboy swore low under his breath. A rough word meant more for himself than for God. For he knew in that instant he was already lost, already bound, that even if he tried to pry his fingers away, even if he laid the sack back down, his soul would never ride free of the memory, never be able to outrun the sound of that cry. Shifting his weight, he pulled the bundle close against his chest, the warmth of it seeping through his dusty shirt, strange and startling against skin that had long grown cold to human touch, and he looked out across the wasteland stretching endless to every horizon, knowing it had offered him only two choices, and he had already made the harder one. He would not leave the child, no matter the cost. His horse stamped impatiently nearby, ears twitching at the scent of something unfamiliar, and as he swung into the saddle with the sack nestled awkwardly but securely in one arm, he felt the desert watching, the stars pricking awake overhead like witnesses, and he muttered again, softer this time, "All right then, little one. Reckon we're in it together now." Though whether he spoke to the child, to himself, or to the ghosts that shadowed his every mile, he could not tell. The horizon burned faintly with the last embers of sunset, and as he urged the horse forward, the cowboy understood that what he carried was not just a fragile life but a fate that would ride with him until the end, a choice no bullet or bounty could undo. The desert stretched endless before him, a canvas of bone-white dust and broken sage that seemed to swallow sound, leaving only the hollow whistle of wind carving its way through stone and scrub. Yet the cowboy heard another sound now, soft and tremulous, rising from the bundle cradled awkwardly against his chest, a cry so small it seemed at odds with the vast emptiness around them, a fragile thread of life pulling at his ears, at his heart, reminding him with every breath that he was no longer alone. He shifted the reins in one hand, the other holding the infant close, the sway of the horse uneven beneath the weight of this new and unfamiliar burden. And each time the child whimpered he felt a pang deep in his gut, not of annoyance, as he might have expected, but of recognition, as if those tiny cries reached back into years he had buried, years when silence had first become his only companion. The wind cut sharp, biting at his face and tearing at his coat. Yet the baby's warmth pressed against him in stark defiance of the chill, and it unsettled him, for in all his wandering he had grown used to the desert's cold indifference, the way it mirrored the hollow place inside him where laughter and love had once lived. But now that hollowness ached, stirred awake by every sound from the fragile being in his arms. His mind drifted back to the graves he never visited. To the boy he had been before blood turned his hands coarse and loneliness became his shadow. And he realized how long he had been riding in silence so complete it had ceased to feel strange. Until this night when a whimper cut through it sharper than any bullet. The horse's hooves struck a steady rhythm, echoing across the hardpan, and he found himself matching the beat of his breath to the child's, steadying himself with the rise and fall of its tiny chest, the simple miracle of it still breathing against all odds. He wondered who had abandoned it, what cruelty had set it in the sand like refuse, and though the thought boiled in him, his mind circled back again and again to his own solitude, to the truth that he himself had been walking the edge of being abandoned by the world for years, a man no one claimed, no one waited for, no one remembered, until now, when a sack in the dirt had tethered him once more to the fragile thread of another's life. The horizon shimmered with heat, though the night crept in cool, stars prickling awake one by one, and he rode through that silence with the uncanny awareness that every cry, every twitch of those tiny fists, echoed inside him like a reminder that his life, long thought over in all but breath, was being rewritten step by step across these barren miles. And as the wind scoured the land bare, as it always had, the cowboy lowered his gaze to the child swaddled close, whispering words he hadn't planned, words that cracked his voice with rust. "Ain't much, but you ain't alone. Not while I got say in it." And though the desert swallowed the promise without echo, he felt its truth settle into him heavier than the colt at his side, a vow born not of blood or duty, but of mercy too dangerous to take back now. The town rose from the desert like a carcass picked clean, buildings bleached by sun, windows hollow-eyed, the clapboard fronts groaning in the dry wind. And as Elijah Rawley, though most just called him the cowboy, rode down its crooked street, the bundle cradled in his arms seemed to draw every gaze sharper than a knife. The baby stirred against him, a soft mule breaking the hush, and heads turned, whispers unfurling like snakes in the dust. Whose child is that? Where'd it come from? Why's he carrying it like it's his own? And though no one spoke plain, their eyes said more than their tongues, fear flashing in their glances, suspicion settling heavy on their shoulders. A woman at the well clutched her shawl tight and spat in the dirt as though warding off a curse, while the blacksmith's hammer fell silent mid-swing. His face twisted not with pity but unease, as if the sight of innocence in a gunslinger's arms was an omen too strange to stomach. Elijah swung down from the saddle slow, boots grinding against the boards as he carried the child toward the mercantile, every step watched like a trial, the infant's tiny breaths loud in the silence, and when he asked for milk, for cloth, for anything that might keep the babe alive, the shopkeeper only shifted back, his eyes narrowing, voice gruff with the weight of superstition. "Ain't got nothing for that. Best take it elsewhere, cowboy, before its curse rubs off on us all." And though Elijah's jaw clenched, he said nothing, for he saw the fear was not only of the child but of whatever story had set it adrift in the desert, a tale too dark for any of them to want part in. One man muttered near the saloon doors, voice dripping with dread. Could be witch-born, could be Apache spawn, could be worse, and the others nodded, eager to believe any tale that set distance between them and the bundle, as though pushing it back into the desert could erase the weight of its existence. Elijah turned slow circles with his gaze, searching the faces for even a flicker of kindness, but found only tight lips, crossed arms, the shuffling of feet that longed to retreat, and he felt the hollowness in his chest deepen, the old familiar ache of being unwelcome, unwanted, now doubled for the child who whimpered softly against his chest, unaware of the judgment spilling over them both. He thought of setting the bundle on the mercantile counter, of forcing their hands, but the thought sickened him, for though his arms burned from holding the weight, he knew already he would sooner burn with it than pass it back to those who recoiled from its cry. So he pulled his hat low, muttered a curse that was less anger than sorrow, and mounted up once more, the saddle creaking as he turned the horse toward the far edge of town, the whispers chasing after him like dust in the wind. As he rode out, The baby's tiny cry cut the silence once more, and he felt every gaze snap shut like a door behind him, the ghost town slamming its heart against him, leaving him no richer in supplies, no lighter in burden, but certain of one thing. The child's survival rested on no one's shoulders but his own, and mercy, once chosen, was a road with no turning back. The cabin that leaned crooked at the town's edge smelled of sage and smoke, its rafters lined with dried herbs that rustled when the door swung open, and inside, hunched beside a low fire, the healer sat with skin like worn leather and eyes clouded but sharp as a hawk's, her gaze cutting straight to the bundle in Elijah's arms before she even raised her gnarled hands. She took the child without ceremony, her touch startlingly gentle for fingers twisted by age, and murmured something low in a tongue older than the boards beneath their feet, swaddling the infant in fresh cloth, feeding it drops of goat's milk from a tin spoon, and Elijah stood rigid, hat in hand, the sight of her care loosening a knot in his chest he hadn't known was wound so tight yet it unraveled only until her words fell, chilling the air sharper than the desert wind. "That voice you heard," she rasped, her eyes never leaving the child's face. "It ain't natural. No newborn speaks. No mouth fresh from the womb forms words. What you carried from the sand weren't just a babe, cowboy. There's a story in that blood, and it ain't one a man like you ought to shoulder." The fire popped, throwing sparks that danced across her shadowed walls, and Elijah shifted uneasily, the memory of that night rising sharp and unwelcome, the sack half buried, the eyes gleaming wet, the impossible sound that had frozen him in place. That small, trembling word carried on desert air. "Mama." His throat worked, but no denial came, for he knew she was right, knew that the cry had not been the natural wail of hunger or fear but something older, stranger, something that still rang in his bones even now. The healer's gaze lifted at last, pinning him where he stood, and her voice, cracked yet steady, pressed heavier than any curse. "Mercy binds, boy. You lift what ain't yours, you carry its curse as much as its hope. Maybe this child brings life, maybe death, maybe both. But the desert don't give gifts free, and you'd best reckon the price before it comes to collect." The babe whimpered then, a fragile sound that pulled his heart like a hook, and the old woman's expression softened, just for a breath, as if even she was not immune to the pull of innocence. She pressed the bundle back into Elijah's arms, her words falling to a whisper. "If you keep it, you guard more than flesh. You guard fate itself. Best remember that when the nights turn long." He took the child back, heavier now, not in weight but in meaning, the fire's glow flickering across its tiny face, and he felt the old wound of loneliness inside him pulse, torn wider by the truth she'd spoken, by the certainty that what he held was more than just a babe abandoned to the sand. He left her cabin with the wind biting harder than before, her warning chasing him out into the dark, an echo that made the desert feel less like emptiness and more like it was watching, waiting, whispering promises he did not yet understand. The trail stretched grim and endless, a scar across the desert where wagon wheels had once cut deep and hooves had churned the earth, but now it bore only the silence of ruin, the air heavy with the smell of ash that no wind had carried away. And as Elijah rode with the infant cradled against his chest, he felt each mile tighten around him like a noose, each rumor he'd chased dragging him closer to the truth he feared. When at last he crested the low ridge, the sight below struck harder than any bullet, the charred bones of wagons scattered like broken ribs across the sand, wheels blackened, iron bands twisted by fire, their shadows long and skeletal in the sun, while shallow graves marked the earth in crooked rows, stones stacked haphazard by hands too weary or too frightened to linger. He dismounted slow, boots sinking into the scorched dirt, and the child stirred with a soft whimper, as if it too could sense the sorrow stitched into this ground, and he hushed it with a trembling hand, though the sound only deepened the ache in his chest. He walked among the wreckage, each step grinding ash beneath his heels, the silence pressing heavy, broken only by the caw of a lone crow circling above, and he saw the remnants of lives, scattered charred pots, a scorched bonnet half buried in sand, a Bible split open and blackened by flame, its words eaten away. Elijah crouched beside one grave, the mound of earth still raw against the desert crust, and for a long moment he stared at the crude cross marking it, wondering if beneath lay kin to the child in his arms, wondering if somewhere among the rows a mother had fallen, a father cut down, a family line ended in fire. He wanted to dig, to uncover, to know. But the thought of disturbing the dead twisted his gut, and instead he stood again, holding the infant close as if shielding it from the sight of its own ghosts. He searched the wreckage for survivors' signs, a scrap of cloth, a trail leading away. But there was nothing, no footprints but his own, no smoke but the long-dead kind, no voices but the whispers of the wind through splintered beams. And he knew then with a sinking certainty that whatever blood had birthed the babe had spilled into this dirt, that no kin remained to claim it, no mother left to answer its impossible cry. His throat tightened, the weight of the healer's words echoing in his skull. There's a story in that blood, and he wondered if this was its beginning, written in ashen graves, or merely another chapter in a tale older than the desert itself. He mounted once more, the horse stamping uneasily at the scent of death, and as he turned away from the massacre, the infant pressed warm against his chest. Elijah felt a strange mingling of sorrow and resolve. The loneliness he had carried for years now, bound to this small life in a way he could not untangle. And though the trail of ashes offered no answers, only silence, he knew the choice was no longer about finding family, the child's or his, but about carrying it forward into a world that had already tried to erase it. And in that choice he felt the weight of destiny settling heavier on his shoulders than the rifle slung at his back. The night was thick with desert chill, the fire burning low as Elijah hunched close, the infant swaddled in his arms, its faint breaths the only comfort against the vast emptiness. When the sound came a horse's snort, the soft crunch of hooves circling just beyond the firelight, followed by voices low and rasping, carrying the unmistakable edge of menace. Shadows peeled from the darkness, riders slipping into view, their eyes catching the flames glow like a pack of coyotes, and their leader, a narrow man with a scar that split his cheek into a permanent sneer, leaned forward in the saddle with a voice like gravel poured slow. "Hand it over, cowboy. Best not let that thing's cry tie you to what you don't understand." Elijah rose, rifle in one hand, the child tight against his chest with the other, his stomach knotting, for the way they spoke told him more than their guns. These men knew of the baby, knew something he had yet to grasp, their hunger not born of greed for coin but of some darker knowledge, some secret carried in the child's blood. Another outlaw spat into the dirt, his grin wide and cruel. "You think you found yourself a blessing out here? You're carrying a curse. Its kin burned with that wagon train, and you'd be wise to let the desert finish the work." The words cut sharper than the fire's smoke, for they confirmed what Elijah had feared since the graves. This child was not simply abandoned but hunted. Its survival, an affront to those who had spilled its family's blood. And now they meant to snuff it out, like the last ember of a fire they had tried to stamp clean. Elijah's grip tightened, sweat chilling on his neck as he weighed his chances. 4 rifles against his 1. Yet the thought of surrender churned his gut worse than any bullet, for though the babe was not his by blood, its cry had already bound itself to him, and he could no more hand it over than he could carve his own heart out. The scarred leader leaned closer, his voice soft but seething. "Don't be a fool, boy. You don't know what you're holding. That voice, it ain't right. It'll bring ruin on you same as it brought ruin on them." And though Elijah's mind burned with questions, his mouth only answered with silence. For in that moment he knew truth or lie, didn't matter. What mattered was that they wanted the child gone, and he would not let it happen. The standoff stretched, fire popping in the stillness, the rider's eyes glinting with cruel certainty, and Elijah's heart thundered as he shifted his weight, rifle rising a fraction, his voice at last breaking the quiet, rough and steady. "You want the child. You'll have to take it from the dead." The words tasted like iron, and for a breath the night held still, the outlaws' sneers faltering before hardening again, hands twitching near their guns, and Elijah felt the desert's silence gather around them like a witness, waiting to see who would spill blood first. The baby stirred, a faint whimper against his chest, and he prayed it would not speak the impossible word again. Not here, not now, for even he feared what power might stir in that sound. But no matter what secrets the outlaws carried, no matter what truth lay hidden in the ashes of the wagon train, Elijah knew this much as the firelight flickered in his eyes. He would bleed. He would kill. He would die before he let them touch the fragile life fate had set in his arms. The desert night split wide with the crack of gunfire, sudden and savage, the outlaws' muzzles spitting flame that lit the sagebrush in savage flashes, and Elijah Rawley dropped to one knee by the fire, the infant cradled tight against his chest as he swung his rifle up with the steadiness of a man who had killed before, though never with such desperation in his veins. His first shot found the scarred leader's shoulder, spinning him half out of the saddle with a howl, and chaos erupted, horses rearing, men shouting, the air thick with smoke and curses, yet Elijah's hands never wavered, his jaw clenched, every pull of the trigger echoing not the cold violence of bounty hunting or border skirmishes, but a vow, raw and unyielding. They would not have the child, not while he still drew breath. Bullets whined past his ear, splintering wood and spraying sparks from the fire, and he rolled to cover, tucking the infant beneath his coat where its warmth pressed fiercely against him, its whimpering cries sharp enough to cut through the roar of battle, driving him harder, faster, steadier, until the night itself seemed to answer his fury. One rider charged in close, pistol drawn, but Elijah rose up sudden, slamming the butt of his rifle into the man's temple and dragging him from the saddle with a strength born not of muscle but of terror and resolve, finishing him with a shot before the dust had settled. Another came from the right, his silhouette framed against the fire, but Elijah's Colt cleared leather quicker, the gunshot ringing like thunder across the flats, dropping the outlaw where he stood, silence falling heavy for a breath before another scream rose, then another, until the night was nothing but fire and smoke and the stench of blood mixing with the desert wind. Through it all the child whimpered, soft but steady, and every sound stoked Elijah's will, turning his loneliness, his years of silence, into a shield sharper than steel, until the last rider fled limping into the darkness, his curses trailing like the hiss of a dying snake, leaving only the scarred leader groaning in the dirt before Elijah's boots. The cowboy stood over him, rifle aimed, chest heaving, the infant's warmth still pressed close, and for a long moment he considered ending it, silencing the man who had spoken of curses and ruin. But the baby shifted against him, its tiny hand brushing his arm, and something stayed his trigger finger, mercy winning by a margin no thicker than breath. With a growl, Elijah lowered the rifle, leaving the man to crawl bleeding into the dark, his life spared not by justice but by the fragile weight Elijah carried. Silence fell at last, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the ragged pull of his own lungs. And when dawn broke pale across the wasteland, the sky painted with streaks of crimson like the blood in the sand, Elijah sat slumped against a stone, his arms wrapped around the child who still lived, still breathed, still fought. And in that fragile warmth he felt the truth cut clear as the rising sun. He was no longer alone, no longer a man drifting aimless through dust and memory, for he had bound himself to this innocent with blood and mercy alike, and nothing, not desert, not death, not the curse whispered in fear could loosen that vow. The trail stretched long and empty beneath the weight of noon, heat shimmering off the hardpan in waves that blurred the horizon, and Elijah rode slow, his body aching from the night's battle, his rifle heavy against his thigh, the child swaddled close against his chest, as if it were the only thing keeping his heart from splintering under the weight of exhaustion. For a while there was only the creak of saddle leather, the steady rhythm of hooves striking the earth, the whistle of hot wind through brittle sage, but then the bundle stirred, a faint wriggle beneath his coat, and the sound came again, soft yet sharp as a knife through the silence. "Mama!" His skin prickled, the hair on his arms standing stiff, for this was no cry born of chance or echo, no babble of an infant's lips, but the same impossible word he had heard when first he lifted the sack from the sand, trembling on the air with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Elijah froze, reins slack in his hand, his breath caught hard in his throat, and for a long moment he could only stare down at the child's small face, its eyes half closed, lips trembling with the sound that no newborn should make, a word carved with weight too ancient for lungs so new. The desert around him seemed to hush, as though even the wind leaned close to listen, and he felt something shift in his chest. Fear, yes, but not only fear, for beneath it throbbed a pulse of awe. A recognition that whatever spoke through this fragile form was not merely human, not merely flesh and bone, but something older, something deeper, something bound to the ashes of the wagon train and the graves that still haunted his mind. His jaw tightened, memories rising unbidden, his brother's dying breath, the faces of men he'd killed, the lonely years when silence had been his only companion, and now this silence was broken not by chance, but by a voice that seemed to drag threads of the dead back into the living. He whispered hoarsely, almost against his will, "Ain't no one here, little one. Ain't no mama left." Yet even as the words left his lips, he felt the lie of them. For the sound carried not just sorrow but intent, as though the child's blood itself remembered, reaching out to claim what was lost. A shiver ran through him despite the blazing heat, sweat cold against his back, and he shifted uneasily in the saddle, the desert stretching endless around him yet feeling suddenly crowded, as if unseen eyes tracked his every mile. The child settled again, its breathing soft, innocent, unknowing, and Elijah swallowed hard, torn between clutching it tighter and holding it away, unsure if he carried a babe of flesh or a vessel for something far greater, or far worse. The healer's words echoed like a curse in his skull. There's a story in that blood, and for the first time he wondered if the story wasn't just tragedy, but prophecy. If the child's impossible whisper was not memory but warning, a voice of what had been and what was yet to come. He urged the horse onward, spurs biting harder than he meant, dust rising behind them as the horizon shimmered, and though he tried to tell himself it was only his mind twisting in exhaustion, his soul already knew the truth. Mercy had set him on a road where the dead still spoke, and the voice in his arms would not be silenced by the desert or by him. The town loomed again on the horizon, its warped rooftops shimmering in the heat, and as Elijah Rawley rode down the main street with the child nestled in his arms, the silence that met him was louder than any gunshot. For every face turned, every step faltered, every whisper curdled into dread at the sight of the cowboy who had left them with questions and now returned with answers none wanted. The child had not been abandoned to the desert's mercy but pulled back from it, cradled as if it belonged to him, and that unsettled them more than if he had come riding with pistols drawn. Women at the well clutched their children tighter, men spat into the dust, muttering about curses and omens, and the saloon doors creaked as half-drunk eyes peered out, greed and fear wrestling in their gaze, for all of them knew the wagon train's fate, and the blood spilled there was not forgotten, nor was the whisper of what had been left behind. Elijah rode steady, face carved from stone, his silence iron against their murmurs, and when he reached the sheriff's office, he swung down, boots grinding against the boards, the child swaddled in one arm, and pushed through the door with the weight of dust and judgment trailing behind him. The sheriff, a broad man with gray in his beard and eyes sharp as barbed wire, looked up from his desk, his hand brushing the butt of the pistol at his hip, not out of fear but habit, and when his gaze settled on the child, his jaw tightened, his voice low and edged with warning. "Rawley, you best think hard about what you're doing. That there ain't no ordinary babe. Folks say it spoke," said the word clear as a bell. "Folks say you're cursed same as it. And trouble, boy, trouble follows curses." Elijah's silence stretched long, the room thick with the scent of tobacco and dust, until at last he shifted the child higher in his arm, the gesture quiet but certain, and the sheriff's face darkened as if the answer had been spoken without words. "You keep it, you'll bring heat down on this whole town. Men who burned that train ain't gonna leave their work half finished. You ready to draw steel every dawn till your luck runs dry?" Still, Elijah said nothing, only met the lawman's eyes with a stare forged in years of blood and solitude. And the sheriff, seasoned enough to recognize a vow when he saw one, leaned back slow in his chair, the boards groaning beneath him, and spat into the spittoon with a clang. "Then you've made your bed, Rawley. Just pray you can lie in it." Outside, the townsfolk still watched, their whispers rising like a storm against the door. But Elijah stepped back into the light without so much as a glance their way, the child breathing soft against his chest. And though he carried no badge, no name worth speaking, no ties save the fragile one in his arms, his silence spoke louder than any proclamation. The baby was his charge now, and no sheriff, no mob, no curse would tear it loose from him. As he mounted up and rode for the edge of town, the sun cut sharp across the horizon, And though every shadow seemed to lengthen with warning, Elijah's grip was steady, his vow unshaken, for he knew that in choosing the child he had already chosen the trouble, and there was no turning back. The desert night wrapped itself in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of wind through sage, a stillness that had once been Elijah Rawley's only companion but now felt changed, filled with the faint rhythm of a child's breathing as the babe lay nestled against his chest, finally surrendered to deep, dreamless sleep. The flames painted his weathered face in shades of gold and shadow, flickering across the lines carved by years of solitude, grief, and blood. And for the first time in longer than he could reckon, those lines softened, as if the desert's cruelty had been eased by the fragile warmth in his arms. He sat motionless, listening to the quiet, to the rise and fall of the child's tiny chest, and it struck him how fierce the past days had been, how he had fought and bled and chosen when once he would have turned away, how the weight of mercy had driven him through fire, through gun smoke, through the whispers of men who saw curses where he saw only a life worth saving. And as the sparks rose to meet the stars, he understood that what the desert had laid at his feet was not a trap or a burden, but a gift wrapped in dust and trial, a reason for his heart to beat steady again when for years it had thudded like a hollow drum. The child shifted, lips parting, a breath escaping in the shape of that impossible word mama, and though the sound still sent a shiver crawling up his spine, it no longer felt like doom whispered from the grave but promise, fragile and strange, the echo of love not yet lost but waiting to be carried forward. Elijah's eyes stung, though no tear fell, for he was not a man accustomed to weeping. But in the glow of the firelight he felt something close, a loosening inside his chest where loneliness had lodged like a bullet for too many years, and he drew the babe closer, his voice rough and low as he muttered words not meant for the wind or the stars but for the small, sleeping soul in his arms. "Don't reckon I'm your mama, little one, but I'll see you through, come dust or blood." The fire popped, throwing sparks that spiraled upward, and the desert around them seemed to breathe, no longer empty but alive, as if it bore witness to the bond forged there among ash and silence. He knew the road ahead would be harsh, that the men who had burned that wagon train were still out there, their vengeance unfinished, their hunger for blood undimmed. But he also knew the difference now, that where once he would have faced it alone, hollow and indifferent, he would now face it carrying not just a rifle but a reason, not just a shadow but a promise. And that knowledge set his jaw with iron resolve. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, ancient and indifferent, but Elijah Rawley no longer felt like one of their nameless, wandering points of light. He felt grounded, tethered, chosen by something beyond his understanding. And though the desert had given him a test as dangerous as any blade, it had also given him a purpose no outlaw, no curse, no grave could strip away. With the firelight dancing across his weathered features and the child's warmth pressed close, he leaned back against the saddle rolled beneath him, eyes half closed, and for the first time in years allowed himself to breathe deep, not as a man waiting for the end, but as a man who had found something worth carrying into the dawn.